Great to speak with you today, Richard, and looking forward to this topic on the role of AI in strategic sourcing. Can you first provide a brief background of yourself?
You bet, Dustin. So I am Senior Vice President of Marketing and Customer Success for LevaData. I've worked over 20 years in the supply chain solution provider space, starting off my career with I2 Technologies in the late 90s. Played different roles with supply chain innovators, focused on supply chain planning and optimization, deployment of business networks, particularly in supply chain procurement and logistics. And then more recently, with my role at LevaData, we're really focused on strategic sourcing and procurement.
Can we first start by defining what is AI?
You bet. I think this is an interesting topic. We're getting a lot of news discussions. You'll hear AI being used in different contexts related to automation or the threat of AI in terms of this notion of the robots will take over to some extent, right? Because of the idea of intelligent computers that can replicate or mirror the cognitive capabilities of the human brain. And what really, the real story though, that we don't really understand oftentimes, that's evolved over time is, AI as a discipline is an area that really goes back to the 1960s, and efforts really in early computing and robotics to take pieces of what the human brain does. It could be in terms of sensing, the five senses. It could be in terms of repeating what humans can do from a manual process perspective in robotics. And it could be in terms of calculating or predicting, for example, the future based on and information processing, to understand, patterns, for example. And today what we have is a combination of technologies which are broadly put under the AI umbrella, but they're different technologies that can be used in different contexts. So when we, at LevaData, when we think about AI, we really look at kind of more specifically the areas of machine learning, pattern recognition, particularly with all this access to new data and data services that we have. So how do you stream and derive intelligence from massive large data sets, but also optimization and predictive technologies that allow us to, apply now at scale with, sort of cloud computing much more rapidly and easily what used to be a huge amount of processing power or, sometimes, very difficult math problems that we can use to apply to specific situations where you're trying to predict, for example, cost. But, AI can also focus on image recognition, for example, for facial recognition, and also natural language processing, which is the ability to understand either written or spoken communication from humans. And that's an area that we look at a bit, and it definitely falls under the AI umbrella, but it's not as relevant to the work that we're doing here at LevaData.
Help the audience understand how AI will impact strategic sourcing professionals.
Well, it's a great question, and what we're seeing is the beginning early period of the adoption in a very pragmatic way of AI-based capabilities broadly in supply chain, and then within strategic sourcing, it's an area that I'd say it's even further behind the innovation adoption curve. And so what we look at is what we call cognitive sourcing. Is our term for describing this intersection of applied AI technologies in the purpose of really supporting or augmenting the intelligence of supply chain professionals, sourcing professionals that are trying to make better decisions. And so what we look at is in terms of kind of a three-level framework of what's the best data and information needed to look at in terms of making strategic sourcing decisions. And most companies today are relying on oftentimes very fragmented data sources that relate to the enterprise history of spend and bills of material and product information, and trying to marry that up with the very robust but very diverse set of information that's more market intelligence or external to the enterprise, and bringing those two worlds together is really the foundation. And then on top of that, we apply different technologies, AI technologies, to derive insights around where emerging risks or opportunities are and it's constantly always on. So it's constantly looking and trying to correlate what the impact of, say, a change in demand for a certain product is internally, maybe a change in the forecast for the, say, the holiday season. What does that mean for the impact on all the existing spend, the suppliers that are going to be dependent upon delivering that increase in volume, and maybe where there's additional cost savings or potential emerging risks because of capacity constraints in the market. So we filter those insights into what we call risks and opportunities, and then we have an intelligent agent called Leva, which is a combination of kind of both chatbot technology as well as AI cognitive sourcing technologies that deliver recommendations to professionals around what the most important risks and opportunities are to act upon, what negotiation levers might be useful to use in what sequence and at what time to negotiate for either better price or reduced risk with key suppliers. And then it learns over time, based upon those iterations of moves that companies make, to constantly improve and get better, so that the accuracy of predicting cost or risk changes, or the combination of negotiation levers that are used to produce a good outcome, are constantly improving, not just across an individual customer, but actually across the community of all LevaData users and customers. So it's an interesting combination of looking at, predictive optimization models, kind of chatbot intelligent assistance, in addition to machine learning and crowdsourced or community-based intelligence. So those are the set of AI technologies that we believe are the fundamentals of what we call this new era of cognitive sourcing.
And can you explain the cognitive sourcing a little bit more? And also, you mentioned earlier that you have a recent study that you did.
Yeah, you bet. So I think at a high level, the implication of what this cognitive sourcing means that's kind of new for a lot of strategic sourcing, or the sourcing process for a lot of companies, is that it's really a shift from interacting with the market, maybe with annual or quarterly major sourcing events, where companies have traditionally not really changed their process or their strategy in these areas for 15 to 20 years, really. And one of the challenges that a lot of these companies have today is that they can't act upon the entire long tail of the spending that they're working through. If they've got a complex set of suppliers, for example, or categories or subcommodities of spend, they have a hard time actually covering, say 10,000 suppliers and all the spend categories. They can't scale out across the opportunity. The second problem is that they're not oftentimes very proactive around predicting changes that might occur in the market and acting ahead of their competitors. So they're oftentimes falling in the same cycle where there's maybe a big supply constraint that's occurring in like NAND memory, or recently in electronics resistors, for example, which is not, individual piece part price for resistors is very, very low. It's sometimes less than 0.01, cent. But if they buy 1 billion of them, it's really meaningful, right, at volume and scale. And sort of the approach with cognitive sourcing is to flip I call it flipping the classroom. It's giving all the information that you need in a filtered, in-context way to a sourcing professional, so that they can act in the market in what we call more of a continuous sourcing cycle. So instead of actually only going to the market in, once a year, once a quarter with information that may be 2 or 3 months old, what if you had this capability that was supporting you, that was always on, giving you recommendations, giving you insights, and then the net result is that you're scaling and looking more comprehensively across, most aspects of your inbound supply chain, including costs and risk, and then more importantly, you're able to maybe take action proactively to avoid risks and challenges in the market, particularly in markets that are very competitive. That becomes a competitive advantage for these companies. So we did a study that we are just about to complete the final published version of it, but we launched last week at the first Cognitive Sourcing Summit that we did in Palo Alto with a number of key partners. And the results of the study were pretty interesting because, on one hand, 93% of the survey respondents said that they want a data-driven capability in their procurement organization, and they're very interested in AI to sense these risks and opportunities or to improve negotiations, but only 52% believe that the talent on their teams are actually ready to leverage and use, this information and to kind of ready for a digital transformation, in short. We also found that 48% really want a market intelligence system that combines information from multiple sources and presents recommendations, but surprisingly 38% said that they don't need market intelligence. They get what they need from their suppliers directly, which is very interesting because it sort of indicates this kind of schism in the market where companies are sort of maybe on one hand comfortable with the sort of relationships that they have with their suppliers, where they're asking their suppliers to give them the information that they need. And when we discussed this survey during the conference last week, Angel Mendez, who is one of the guest speakers, said it's like in the sourcing profession, it's like they're bringing a knife to a gunfight because of the investment and sophistication of the supplier side or the seller side of the dynamic is increasingly gotten more sophisticated. They're seeing all the market information and they're going into these negotiations much better armed than the actual buyers are, particularly in the strategic sourcing and procurement of direct material sourcing teams in large global manufacturers. And so the idea is to kind of level the playing field and not rely on the supply information, but actually provide new sources of information and insight. The other aspect of the survey that was pretty interesting is that we looked at the RFQ process, particularly around direct material sourcing. And what we found was that only 56% of all suppliers are actively engaged with annually out of 100% of their total supply base. So this means that they're only really working in the market and engaging with their suppliers roughly a little over 50% of the time and 50% of their total number of suppliers. And they're using oftentimes 55% email and spreadsheets or custom development tools to manage that RFQ process. And we also found that the average performance from the RFQ kind of cycle time is 14 days in preparation and 26 days in negotiation, taking a little bit over 40 days to complete a cycle. But we found some best-in-class companies that are operating on 1 day of preparation, 2 days of negotiation, and 3 days total cycle time. And so our observation is that is a massive opportunity for competitive advantage for companies to actually, change and look at their model very strategically around how they're engaging with their supply base and use these cognitive technologies to basically get them to a best-in-class performance. And you can just kind of think about it, right, in terms of, how two major competitors might be working in the market. The one that's actually able to work, in days versus weeks and months is going to win, particularly in these markets like in high tech and consumer electronics that are, fast-moving product life cycles, very tight margins, and price curves that change, in the matter of months. That becomes pretty mission critical to look at this area as a new source of innovation. But the big takeaway that we had at the conference was everyone agreed that, this area has just not received the level of innovation and focus and support that maybe other aspects of supply chain or other, groups and departments within these companies have really had, around focus around maybe marketing or digital customer engagement or, even within finance and accounting. And so my point of view is that I think we should really look at this area and really prioritize it and look for innovation and really advocate for a conversation to explore the art of the possible, because the technologies and the capabilities are just landing now, and they're potentially highly disruptive for, early adopters, right, who really kind of take this as part of their key strategy. So that's what's pretty exciting about the space.
Well, thanks, Richard, for sharing today. And I look forward to staying in touch if you want to continue discussions on this topic.
Thank you so much, Dustin. I appreciate the opportunity.